Many people are familiar with Alexis de Tocqueville and his magnum opus on politics in the United States, even if they've never read it, Democracy in America. Tocqueville, who had originally visited the United States to report on its prison system, ended up writing one of the best analyses of pre-Civil War and pre-New Deal America. The genius of America and American democracy, as Tocqueville noted throughout his work, was how civil society was the heart and soul of the participatory lives that Americans lived. But now, 200 years after Tocqueville, we see a large, bureaucratic, and consolidated imperium in the place of that democratic civil society that so enamored Tocqueville. As Tocqueville traveled, observed, and conversed, he grew in his affinity for the local dynamism of the United States. As he says, "It is not the administrative, but the political effects of the local system I most admire in America." That sentence, that single sentence, summarizes the spirit of democracy in America. And so we should repeat it again so we understand what Tocqueville is saying. It is not the administrative, but the political effects of the local system I most admire in America. In fact, his concentration on the township and county governments is where he begins his great work of political commentary after having ruminated on the geographic and demographic origins of the United States. It is here that we have the greatest witness to the early realities of the American Union. As Tocqueville writes, "It is proposed to examine the following chapter, what is the form of government established in America, on the principle of the sovereignty of the people. What are its resources, its hindrances, its advantages, and its dangers? The first difficulty which presents itself arises from the complex nature of the Constitution of the United States, which consists of two distinct social structures, connected and, as it were, encased one within the other. Two governments completely separate and almost independent, the one fulfilling the ordinary duties and responding to the daily and indefinite calls of the community, the other circumscribed with certain limits, and only exercising an exceptional authority over the general interests of the country. In short, there are 24 small sovereign nations whose agglomeration constitutes the body of the Union." The United States that Tocqueville traversed and wrote about was an America of sovereign individual states and their dynamic townships and counties, which served as the pulsating heart of the American spirit and experience. The federal government, as he later says, is the exception. The government of the states is the rule. That is, the federal government wasn't the vibrant heart of the American Union. The individual states and their townships were. The federal government had few powers, as Tocqueville later goes on to describe, and merely existed to exercise authority over the general interests of the country. When Tocqueville begins to describe the federal Constitution of the United States, he observes much the same. As he says, "The attributes of the federal government were therefore carefully enumerated, and all that was not included amongst them was declared to constitute a part of the privileges of the several governments of the states. Thus, the government of the states remained the rule, and that of the Confederation became the exception." Note again what Tocqueville says. The government of the states remained the rule, and that of the Confederation became the exception. Tocqueville sees the same limited enumerated powers as did the Federalist Fathers, who, in Federalist 45 wrote, "The powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Indeed, this near anarchic absence of federal administration struck Tocqueville as an oddity. As he openly muses, nothing is more striking to a European traveler in the United States than the absence of what we term the government or administration. Written laws exist in America, and one sees that they are daily executed. But although everything is in motion, the hand which gives the impulse to the social machine can nowhere be discovered. Part of the intriguing ingenuity of the American experience and American democracy for Tocqueville was how the spirit and motion of sovereignty rested not in an administrative, consolidated, or centralized federal government, but in the small townships and the larger counties to which the Americans had their most concrete loyalty and existence. All the social obligations of being a citizen were manifested at the local level. Moreover, Tocqueville recognized that this decentralized, or more properly diffused and diminutive political system aided in preventing an extensive centralized administration. The two methods of diminishing the force of authority in a nation, he noted, were first to weaken the supreme power in its very principle by forbidding or preventing society from acting in its own defense under certain circumstances, and secondly, in distributing and exercising of its privileges in various hands. It was the second method that was principally manifested in America through the townships, the counties, and the municipal governments. When reading Tocqueville, we begin to witness the old truth that participatory civil society keeps away the supreme centralized power, the centralizing and administrative power of government bureaucracy and what we now know and call the administrative state. It is the vibrancy of civil society that provides the freedom of individuals, as they are not burdened by the laws, the regulations, and the dictates of a centralized administration, precisely because they have no need for that centralized administration, because most of their daily duties and the regularities of their lives are found in civil society. Additionally, where administrative political centers had been erected, such as in state legislatures and governments, Americans had taken careful action to ensure divided government, precisely so as to diminish as much as possible centralized power. States, with the brief exception of Pennsylvania, which would soon follow the example of the other states, had all divided their legislatures into multiple bodies, a House of Representatives and a Senate, which is also true of the constitutional federal government of the United States. As Tocqueville writes, the only advantages which result from the present Constitution of the United States are the division of the legislative power and the consequent check upon political assemblies. As anyone who takes a basic Civics 101 course knows, one of the hallmarks of the American Constitution is the division and the separation of power and the checks and balances between the different bodies of American government. Tocqueville recognizes this as the great advantage of the American Constitution and why it fosters the spirit of liberty and democracy because of it. As he writes again, the only advantages which result from the present Constitution of the United States are the division of legislative power and the consequent check upon political assemblies. The purpose of dividing the legislature into two houses instead of having a single legislature was to ensure the check upon political assemblies. Why? As any student of political philosophy trained before 1945 would have known, there is nothing intrinsically good about democracy in of itself. Democracy can be good. Democracy can also be bad. Democracy can be good when the citizenry is good. Democracy can be bad when the citizenry is bad. Political forms are not intrinsically good or bad. It is the people who make up the population within that political form that move those political societies in the direction of goodness, liberty, and justice, or tyranny, destruction, and oppression. This is why it is necessary to also have those checks and balances, those check upon political assemblies, because one in a democratic society does not quite know the content and the character of the politicians that they are electing. The more Tocqueville pondered and observed this divisionary phenomenon of government, the more he grew fond of it. As he writes, this theory of divided legislatures, which was nearly unknown to the republics of antiquity, which was introduced into the world almost by accident, like so many of other great truths, and misunderstood by several modern nations, he's referring to France here, is at length become an axiom in the political science of the present age. In short, the genius and exceptionalism of the early American Republic was in her vibrant civil society, which negated the need for any autocratic, administrative, or centralized government, which in turn led to the creation of divided legislatures, which would mitigate the need for those autocratic, administrative, and centralized governments. America's energetic and exuberant civil society, flourishing at the level of the township in New England and the counties in the Ohio River Valley and the South, is what Tocqueville most acutely means as the basis of democracy in America. The democracy that is genuine, the democracy that concerns Tocqueville, is self-rule, the self-rule of the people in townships, communes, and counties, without the need of overriding administrative and bureaucratic authority. True mass democracy is something local, not national. The contrast to the diffused and diminutive democratic system which had sprung up in America is the administrative and bureaucratic model of centralism. True, Tocqueville had the foresight to see, paradoxically, how an administrative and centralized apparatus already existed in America by virtue of existing legislatures, constitutions, and organized federal apparatuses, however minor and small they may have been in Tocqueville's time. They could, as he noted, sweep in and overtake the ingenuity and the energy of the localities. But his foresight into this problem should have served more as a warning than a deterministic prophecy of the future destruction of the American experiment and democratic spirit. In fact, the wisdom of Tocqueville's observations about centralism stands for all time and resonates with any liberty-loving patriot. Centralization, he writes, succeeds more easily, indeed, in subjecting the external actions of men to a certain uniformity, which at least commands our regard, independently of the objects to which supplied. Centralization imparts without difficulty an admirable regularity to the routine of business, provides for the details of the social police with sagacity, represses the smallest disorder and the most petty misdemeanors, maintains society in a status quo, alike secure from improvement and decline, and perpetrates a drowsy precision in the conduct of affairs, which is hailed by heads of the administration as a sign of perfect order and public tranquility. In short, It excels more in prevention than in action. Note again two of the core ideas that Tocqueville sees in the philosophy of political centralism. One is that it subjects men to a certain uniformity, which commands them all to act the same. And then second, it excels more in the prevention of action than in the permission of action. Tocqueville's profound insight in stating that the purpose of centralized administration is more about preventing activity than allowing activity or unleashing it is, of course, shockingly prescient. What is one of the great critiques of centralized politics and the increase of regulation? That it stems and that it prevents human action. For the origins of the movement to America's administrative and centralized imperium are precisely what Tocqueville noted: the prevention of activity. It is the essence of administrative centralized states to regulate and consolidate, to homogenize and compartmentalize, in expectation for rote, mundane, mechanical efficiency. The purpose of administrative states is to brush away the old forces of pluralism, particularity, and the diffused inefficiencies for that unitary robotic machine. This, of course, was the dream of the 20th century progressives. Here, it is necessary to take a step back to the very beginning of Tocqueville's Democracy in America to recognize how metaphysical assumptions also influence politics. Tocqueville begins his second chapter by drawing an analogy of national growth to that of a child with parents. In Tocqueville's analogy, we see an organic and generationist view of nations, something that he shares with other great political thinkers like Aristotle and Edmund Burke, who argued that it is the love fostered in a family which permits the love and the growth of a country. This, too, was the underlying message of this chapter, wherefrom he described the origins and growth of the American Union out of the Anglo-American colonists who brought with them their traditions and ideals and planted them into the North American soil. Tocqueville's understanding of man and nations was organic and generationist, deriving from the love of family. Progressives, by contrast, were the true heirs of the so-called Enlightenment, the materialistic and mechanical view of the world which should also impact politics. Their understanding of man and nations was analogous to the materialist and mechanical philosophers of the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century, who saw man and the Commonwealth, as Thomas Hobbes did, as a machine, an artifice, a construction to be molded and brought into working mechanical efficiency. This is the spirit of English progressivism and socialism from Hobbes to Wells, as well as, one might argue, into the present day. For the progressive, the vibrancy, the messiness, and the differentiations of civil society were a problem that needed to be regulated and fixed, rather than an activity to encourage. The progressives tried to make this a reality in the early 1900s, but of course failed. It was only after the Great Depression, through the ideology of centralization known as the New Deal, and the subsequent Great Society of the 1960s, at least in America, that the progressive reformers achieved their remaking of America and the prevention of the activities of civil society under the new federal bureaucratic apparatus. Civil society, and now the 50 states that exist today, are all subjected to the federal administrative state. The administrative state declares what is right and what is wrong. The administrative state encourages how to live and how not to live. The administrative state passes all the laws without our consent, telling us what is legal and what is illegal. The administrative state feeds off the energy and pulsations of civil society, small businesses, and the many states, but in feeding off of it, it then channels it into itself. It does not act with the best interests of civil society, small businesses, and the many states, but tries to eliminate that energy by directing it all to itself. And in directing everything to itself, as Tocqueville noted, the spirit of centralization, quote, imparts without difficulty an admirable regularity to the routine of business, provides for the details of the social police with sagacity, represses the smallest disorder and the most petty misdemeanors, maintains society in a status quo, alike secure from improvement and decline, and perpetuates a drowsy precision in the conduct of affairs, which is hailed by heads of the administration as a sign of perfect order and public tranquility. In short, it excels more in prevention than action. The great parasitic irony about modern American democracy is that it is not democratic at all, not at least in the sense that Tocqueville meant it. Again, democracy, which Tocqueville saw in America, was a democracy of engaged citizens through participatory civil society. Democracy was the energy, the vibrancy, the motion, and the movement of Americans in their civil society, at the local level, in their towns, in their municipalities, in their counties, and in their states. This democratic ethos and spirit negated any need for an extensive administrative, bureaucratic, and centralized form of government. That absence of a federal government that shocked Tocqueville, and as he said, would shock any European. The rule of the township and the county, the rule of the individual states whose life is given to them by the township and county, was the normative democratic rule of the early American political experience. Voting for a president or a senator doesn't constitute democracy in Tocqueville's eyes, nor does voting for the federal government to solve one's problems. The individual's participation in the everyday actions of society, that is what constitutes democracy for Tocqueville. We live now under that centralized administrative state against which Tocqueville warned. In Tocqueville's day, he compared the unhappy despotism of the centralized state to China. Again, he is perhaps very prescient on this notion. As he writes, China appears to me to be present the most perfect instance of that species of well-being which a completely central administration may furnish to the nations among which it exists. Travelers assure us that the Chinese have peace without happiness, industry without improvement, stability without strength, and public order without public morality. If Tocqueville were alive today, he might now include America as that centralized state, which brings peace without happiness, industry without improvement, stability without strength, and public order without morality. Many of our contemporary and self-proclaimed constitutionalists, those who eulogize the Constitution, are in fact anti-constitutionalists. They fail to see that the Constitution that Tocqueville wrote about, that had limited powers, no longer truly exercises any power over the administrative bureaucracy and the administrative apparatus set up in the aftermath of the Great Depression, World War II, the Great Society, and the Cold War. When we read Tocqueville, we shouldn't be romantics, thinking that the America he described, still exists today. Maybe there are pockets in which that America still exists, but the political America that he described, the rule of the townships, the counties, and the states as the norm, is no more. Instead, we have the rule of the Imperial Presidency, the administrative state, and its bureaucracy. And yet, in so many ways, Tocqueville saw in the 1830s this very possibility. For in the seeds of this resplendent new union he was traversing in all of its democratic vibrancy, he also saw the potential for centralized authority and what he called royal prerogatives to emerge. Turning now to the presidency in Tocqueville's time was limited. It was, as the constitutional fathers intended, inferior to the Congress, yet had the possibility of enlarging into the imperial and totalitarian monster it is today. Almost 200 years ago, Tocqueville noted, if the existence of the Union were perpetually threatened, and if the chief interests were in daily connection with those of other powerful nations, the executive government would assume an increased importance in proportion to the measures expected of it, and those which it would carry into effect. Let us reread and listen again to what Tocqueville wrote nearly 200 years ago, 190 years ago, when he wrote, if the existence of the Union were perpetually threatened, and if the chief interests were in daily connection with those of other powerful nations, the executive government would assume an increased importance in proportion to the measures expected of it, and those which it would carry into effect. And is this not the world that America now lives in? The world in which it is perpetually threatened, a world in which its chief interests are daily connected with those of other powerful nations. And what would result in this world? The executive government would assume an increased importance in proportion to the measures expected of it. If Tocqueville were alive today and observing the situation of America with a now globalized world and its constant invocation of perpetual threats and national interests and national security, he would probably not be surprised that the democratic ethos of civil society, the township, and the autonomous local county have been crushed by the royal prerogatives of the executive and the administrative bureaucracy built around it. And yet, when reading Tocqueville, we must again not be romantics in thinking that the world of non-globalized realities is the world we live in. For those who desire a return to the true democracy and the true freedom that enamored Tocqueville and was the actual democracy and the freedom that inspired the 19th century revolutionaries, we need to be able to see and try to chart out that compromise between living in a globalized, security-based world with the importance of still exercising dynamism, energy, and liberty within civil society.